we're going to do something a little different. There's a lot of information in it, and so we're really going to focus mostly on the civil rights movement. And so I've combined all the information on the civil rights movement from chapters 27 and 28 into one PowerPoint on the civil rights movement. In 1960, JFK was elected to the presidency. He will be the youngest elected president in American history, and he's also the first and only Roman Catholic president ever elected. It was a very close election between JFK, the Democrat, and Richard Nixon, the Republican. Nixon had a lot of notoriety because he had been the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, but JFK was also a World War II hero, and he was from the very famous and wealthy Kennedy family. And so we're going to initiate really a new age in America with the election of 1960. When JFK became president, he initiated his new domestic policy known as the New Frontier. And one of the things that he pushed for was federal aid for schools. He felt that in order to make the schools better across the board and more equal across the board, that the federal government needed to bring in more money for those schools. He's also going to push for conservation of natural resources, new highway construction. As the country was growing and modernizing, we needed new highways, and he wanted housing and community development. He's not going to get a lot of these things. During his presidency, even though he is a Democrat and the House of Representatives was controlled by the Democrats most of this time, he doesn't have a lot of support from Southern Democrats. So he is going to really struggle to get some of the things that he wanted, and he will actually have to use executive power quite often to get many of the things that he wanted. He was able to get Congress to pass a couple of measures that will help propel the New Society forward. And one of these is he got an increase in the minimum wage from $1 to $1.25 an hour. Of course, today as we look at these numbers, we think, oh my goodness, that's so low. But this was an increase in the minimum wage from $1 to $1.25 an hour. He also got a bump in Social Security benefits for America's aging population. And he got the Housing Act of 1961 passed. The Housing Act of 1961 provided federal funds and grants to help build more middle-class housing in America. Because of the baby boom, we were having a shortage of housing in the country. And so the federal government will be giving grants to states and local authorities to build middle-class housing. Also, part of that, to get people to and from work, the government will give funding to build more mass transit systems, subway systems and rail systems throughout the country. And also to make our cities more palatable, to make us, better places to live. They will also build parks and green spaces in the cities with some of the federal funds. One of the issues that really took off during Kennedy's presidency, though, is the civil rights movement. We talked in a couple of the previous chapters about the very basics and the beginnings of the civil rights movement, some of the initiatives that Harry Truman had, and he was unable to get most of those things, but he was able to integrate the military. And then, of course, we had during Dwight Eisenhower's administration the famous Brown versus Board of Education case, which ordered the integration of public schools and ruled that separate and equal was unconstitutional. And then, of course, we had the really momentous beginnings of the civil rights movement with the Montgomery bus boycott. After the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, the civil rights movement really began to take off in the South. And in 1960, we will have our first, what became known as a sit-in for African American students will go into the local Woolworths, and sit down at the lunch counter there. Of course, this is South Carolina or North Carolina, and they had segregated eating spaces, and so the students were ordered to leave. They were told they would not be served, and the students just sat there quietly, peacefully, even when they were harassed and called names and even experienced some physical attacks. They sat there very quietly, and at the end of the day, they left, and then the next day they came back. What we begin to see with the success of the sit-ins in Greensboro is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, began to organize more and more of these lunch counter sit-ins. The Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, eventually agreed to integrate their lunch counter, and so then other sit-ins were held at other eating establishments across the South, and we began to see gradually an integration of some of these public places. Another thing that became very prominent during the early 1960s was something that were called the Freedom Rides. The Congress on Racial Equality, or also known as CORE, began to organize these freedom rides where the interstate bus lines, we don't see buses very much anymore, but Greyhound was the major bus line at this time. You also had Trailways. I don't think Trailways is in business anymore, but these interstate buses were segregated, and they did not allow the whites and African Americans to sit with each other on these buses once they got into the southern areas. So CORE began to organize these freedom rides where the bus students and non-students would get on these buses in northern cities, and they would sit beside each other, integrated the buses, and then when they got into the southern states where integration was demanded, they would refuse to segregate. On these freedom rides, we see many, many acts of violence. The buses were often attacked. Sometimes they were burned. They were overturned. They were just some very horrific things happened on these freedom rides. Eventually, what happens is, because the violence is so prevalent, Robert Kennedy, who is the Attorney General under his brother John, will have to send in federal marshals to protect these buses as they move into these southern regions. Because of the publicity of the violence on the freedom rides, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which, if you'll remember from earlier chapters, has oversight over all interstate business. The Interstate Commerce Commission actually will order that all interstate buses have to be integrated. So there was success from the freedom rides. However, like I said, there was a great deal of violence that came along with that. People suffered greatly before being able to achieve this integration of the buses. The success of the sit-ins and the freedom rides prompted more demonstrations and marches throughout all of these deep southern states. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was the organization that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. organized, participated, CORE, SNCC. We will see all of these demonstrations and marches and boycotts occurring throughout the southern states. And of course, the objective is to establish restoration of civil rights for African Americans, to get rid of segregation, to integrate all public places, including schools, lunch counters, hotels, universities, all over the South. They wanted to restore voting rights. So we're going to see many of these demonstrations and marches. And oftentimes along with these came violence from the people in these areas who did not want to see change in their society. An example of an attempt to integrate university was when James Meredith, who was a Army veteran, tried to enter the University of Mississippi, which we more commonly refer to today as Ole Miss. When he tried to enroll in the school based on the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, he was denied admission. And eventually, he tried to enroll, he tried to go anyway, and so he was physically barred from going into the registration hall on the campus. And so Robert Kennedy, as I said, the Attorney General, is actually going to have to send troops down to Ole Miss to forcefully make the governor of Mississippi open the doors and allow James Meredith to enter the school, register for his classes, and become a student at Ole Miss. Meredith will experience a lot of harassment while he's there. There were demonstrations and marches to try to keep him out of the school, but he prevailed, and he was eventually became a student and graduated from Ole Miss. We will also see a huge movement for voter registration, and there are going to be a lot of voter registration drives across the South during the 1960s. Voting is the key to all of the civil rights, because until African Americans could vote, they cannot have a voice in society, and so they need to have the vote so they can vote out these these racists that are in control of their states and put better people into positions of power. They can hopefully maybe get elected to positions in their state, local, and even the National Congress. So we'll see these voter registration drives occurring across all of the South. The most famous voter registration drives that were going to occur in 1963 and 1964, these are known as Freedom Summer, where we will have young Northerners, many of them are white, will move down into these southern regions, especially like Mississippi and Alabama, which were very noted for their segregation. And they will live among the African American community in those states, and they will work to educate them so that they can pass literacy tests that are still in place in those states. They will work with them to organize, to go to the voter registration offices to get registered to vote. Oftentimes these voter registration officials were very biased and racist, and the attempts by these young people were often met with violence. In one instance in Mississippi, 3 of these voter registration students were actually killed, and they were buried in a levee in Mississippi. But the result of the voter registration drives was that we will see an increase in voter participation among minorities, especially African Americans, in many of the southern states. This is a couple of pictures that I wanted to show you from the sit-ins. The first, the one on the left, you can see the 4 young African American men who are sitting at the lunch counter. They're just sitting there very quietly, demanding to be, served. Of course, they're being ignored. They're not being served. But this is a nonviolent movement. They will not resort to violence when they are attacked, and they sit there very peacefully, even when they are harassed. The picture on the right shows you one of the freedom buses that was attacked and actually burned during those freedom rides in the early 1960s. In May of 1963, violence is going to break out in one of the most notoriously segregated cities in the country, and that was Birmingham, Alabama. Because of some demonstrations and boycotts in Birmingham, Alabama, the local police there, led by Bull Connor, who was their local sheriff, became very violent toward the marchers and demonstrators. There's a picture here on the slide where you can see the police allowing a police dog to attack one of the demonstrators. Because of the sweeping public opinion about civil rights in the country. Many of these acts of violence were televised, and we saw them on the local news at night. And because of the violence being televised, more and more people could begin to see just how horrific conditions were in some of these very segregated Deep South areas. And there began to be more and more of a push that segregation had to end in these areas, and people like Bull Connor had to be held accountable for these acts of violence against the demonstrators and African Americans in their cities. Because of the negative publicity, there was a lot of pressure put on the officials in Birmingham, and Birmingham will actually end segregation in all of the public places in the city. So the result, even though there's a lot of violence and people were injured, they do actually end up winning. Because also of the publicity that came out about Birmingham, pressure began to be put on President Kennedy that there needed to be more done on a federal level to fully integrate the South, to end these racist policies in the South, and to end this violence that was occurring throughout the South. So President Kennedy will introduce a civil rights bill to Congress, trying to push for full integration of the South and equality in the South. JFK's civil rights bill was blocked by Southern Democrats who did not want to see integration in the South. One of the things that they were opposed to was one of the statements in the civil rights bill, and I'm going to read this to you. It says, race will be removed as a consideration in American law and life. And because of the long years of segregation in the South, the Southern Democrats were greatly opposed to that, and they voted against the bill. So this is one time when we see a party being split. The president is a Democrat, but he's from the North. The Southern Democrats will not support the desegregation legislation that he is pushing forward. After President Kennedy's civil rights bill failed to pass Congress, the civil rights leaders across the country got together and organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And of course, one of the major leaders of this group was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. During the March on Washington, we're going to see that this is going to be the largest political demonstration in American history. Over 250,000 people actually participated in the March on Washington. Once we had the march, they gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for 6 hours of speeches that were given by a lot of prominent individuals at the time. The final speech of the day was given by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and of course it's one of his most famous speeches. It's his I Have a Dream speech. This is the one that became really kind of the inspiration for a lot of people. The March on Washington really showed all American society that we need to strive for equality. Dr. Martin Luther King's approach of nonviolence brought a lot of white people into the movement that may not have gotten into the movement otherwise. And it really just propelled the civil rights movement to a high level in America, that this was something that needed to be expedited. We have to initiate civil rights in American society for all Americans, regardless of race. One of the things that we see with the civil rights movement that will help it in the 1960s is this time, unlike during Reconstruction, the Supreme Court will aid in the implementation of civil rights. During the 1960s, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was Earl Warren, and he was a strong supporter of the civil rights, and he is going to give interpretations from his position, as will the other justices give interpretations that will help expedite civil rights in America. Of course, one of these cases we've talked about in a previous chapter, and that is the Brown versus Board of Education case, which said that separate was inherently unequal, and it ordered the integration of schools and public places with all deliberate speed. But of course, we see 6 years, 7 years, 10 years after this ruling of 1954 that many places were still segregated, and that is why we are having the marches and the demonstrations throughout the South. But in 1969, the Supreme Court will rule that segregation of schools must end at once, that the schools must organize a plan, a valid, concrete plan for integration of their schools. And so in 1969, we do begin to see the integration of public schools in America on a wholesale basis. Some of the schools will actually have to go under what they called consent decrees, where whole school districts will be placed under the oversight of a federal judge, and that federal judge will oversee the integration of schools in those areas. One of the things that we saw that came as a challenge, however, was especially in some of the cities, and especially in some of the northern cities, we had de facto segregation of the schools because people lived in racially divided neighborhoods. African Americans did not live among whites. And so the Supreme Court will also uphold the concept of busing students from one school district to another, busing students across cities to make sure that the schools were actually integrated so that we would not have all white schools and all black schools. Busing met with huge amounts of violence across many of our northern cities, like Chicago. School buses were actually attacked because people did not want their children to be moved out of their neighborhoods to schools across town. But the Supreme Court will uphold that busing is mandatory in order to integrate the schools in the country. In November of 1963, of course, we have one of the great tragedies of American society, and that was the assassination of President Kennedy. So that brought an end to Kennedy's attempts to bring about civil rights in America. And as I had said before, he had been struggling because he could not get the Southern Democrats on board with his program. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald. And then a couple of days later, Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin, was assassinated by a local nightclub owner in Dallas, Jack Ruby. So we never know the extent really of what was behind the Kennedy assassination. Did Oswald act alone? Was there a conspiracy? Who was behind the conspiracy? So it left a lot of unanswered questions. That is for another discussion. We are discussing civil rights in this PowerPoint. So with the assassination of Kennedy, a Texan, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who we lovingly refer to as LBJ, became the President of the United States. And LBJ is an interesting figure. He had been a member of the Senate, a very strong member of the Senate for years. And so he is actually going to be able to use his legislative experience to push through a lot of the civil rights legislation that Kennedy was unable to get pushed through. LBJ is a strong believer in civil rights. A lot of it comes from his background. He grew up very poor in the Texas Hill Country, and he really has that classic rags to riches story. And in his early years right out of college, he taught school at a very poor, predominantly Hispanic school in Texas, where a lot of the kids did not have adequate clothes or food. And that really touched his heart, and he really felt that we needed to make America what he called a great society that gave equal opportunity to all Americans. And so that is going to be his mantra during his presidency. His domestic agenda is going to be called the Great Society. In 1964, LBJ is elected to the presidency in his own right, and he sees one of the driving forces in the presidency is to push through Kennedy's Civil Rights Act. And basically, most of the things in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 are the things that Kennedy had pushed for in 1961, 1962. But LBJ, as I was saying earlier, because of his legislative experience, his ability to kind of wheel and deal with people in the legislature, was actually able to push through that Civil Rights Act, which was a more comprehensive Civil Rights Act, and it called for desegregation of all public accommodations, equal opportunities in employment, in addition to, ending segregation in America. And so this was like the first real modern Civil Rights Act that we will see that opens the door for really making America a more equal society. The following year, he pushed through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This came really much as a result of those voter registration drives that have been going on in the South since 1963 and 1964, and a lot of the violence that those civil rights workers met when they were trying to get African Americans registered to vote in those southern states. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed the literacy test. This was one of the old holdovers from Reconstructions. One of the ways that they were able to keep minorities from registering to vote in many of these southern states was forcing them to take a literacy test that was very difficult. So the literacy tests were actually outlawed in this Voting Rights Act in 1965. It also placed states and districts within states under federal supervision when a large percentage of their voting age population was not registered to vote. So in areas like Mississippi and Alabama, there would be federal supervisors who would look at the registrar of voters' offices in those counties and on the state level, and those areas would be under federal supervision to ensure that they were not using illegal tactics to keep minorities from registering to vote. In 1965, and if we look at across the southern states, only about 6% of the minorities in the South were voting. But after the Voting Rights Act was passed, in just 2 years, we have moved that minority voting registration up to 35%. So it was effective, and so we were beginning to get federal supervision was being able to push forward and get minorities registered to vote in these states. In 1965, we're going to see a really kind of a shift of the civil rights movement from just the South into the urban areas of the United States. About 70% of blacks in the United States lived in urban areas, and most of those urban areas were lower socioeconomic areas, places that we would call, honestly, ghettos in America. In 1965, in Watts, in Los Angeles, California, there was a riot that occurred in that neighborhood. Watts was the largest ghetto in Los Angeles, and there was a confrontation between an African American and the police in that area. And the African American man was beaten, and the citizens in that area just erupted into violence. And over a series of several days, there was looting of businesses, burning businesses, attacking people, burning, rioting. After several days of this, they actually had to bring in National Guard troops. They brought in police from all over the city. And 34 people were actually killed in the Watts riots. About 4,000 people were actually jailed. And the Watts riots really became kind of a symbol for the poverty and helplessness and hopelessness that a lot of African Americans felt in these urban centers in America. And so it kind of shifted the focus that the problems that African Americans were experiencing was not just in the South. It wasn't just in those segregated states of South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana. It was areas in the North, in these urban cities, where these people were living in just abject poverty. And over a period of about 3 years, from 1965 to 1968, there were about 300 different riots in these predominantly African American urban ghetto areas in America. And so it brings a new focus to the civil rights movement, that we have to look at what's going on in those areas also that's causing this sweeping violence. The violence in the urban areas really showed us that there were other problems, as I was saying, that needed to be addressed. And it also caused really a split in the civil rights movement. Prior to this, Martin Luther King Jr. was considered to be the leader. Southern Christian Leadership Conference and organizations like CORE and SNCC were the major organizers of the demonstrations and boycotts, and their central theme was nonviolence. But what we see after these riots in these urban areas is that many African Americans are discontented with that nonviolent approach. They say that it's taking too long, and that the African American leaders like Martin Luther King really are, to use their terms, Uncle Toms. They're working with the American white man, and they're not really looking out for African Americans. And one of the big leaders that emerges in what becomes known as this kind of Black Power movement is Elijah Muhammad. He organized a group that is sometimes referred to as the Black Muslims. They are the Nation of Islam. And it really is pretty much an anti-white movement. It really called for segregation of the races, keeping blacks and whites separate from each other. They wanted African Americans to have power over their own communities, but they did not want, they didn't believe that African Americans and whites should get married, should work together, those types of things. Malcolm X emerged as one of the main speakers and leaders of the Nation of Islam, the Black Muslims. He had converted to the Muslim religion while he was serving time in prison. And when he came out, he joined this group, and he became this very dynamic speaker. And he really rallied a lot of the urban African Americans to the movement. They could identify with him. He was from more of an urban setting, and he had lived through a lot of the prejudice that was going on in the cities. And so he really mobilized and organized these people, and they came to him, and he really became the most prevalent of the Nation of Islam speakers. And some people say that there was some jealousy from Elijah Muhammad because of the popularity of Malcolm X. But what we do know is shortly before Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, that he had begun to move away from some of the more extreme ideals of the Black Muslims. He had made a journey to Mecca, the home of Muhammad, and he had come to realize that the preaching of the hate and the separation of races was actually against the true Muslim faith. And so he began to back away from some of those more radical ideas that he had had. Malcolm X was assassinated while he was giving a speech in 1965, and he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam because of the rivalry and the pulling away, really, of him from Elijah Muhammad. But with the assassination of Malcolm X, that did not end the Black Power movement. That mantle was taken up by others, and one of the new central leaders of that Black Power movement was Stokely Carmichael. And some of the things that we're looking at in the Black Power movement that they are looking to try to initiate is they want Black-owned businesses. They want local control of their schools. If we live in Black urban areas, then the school board should be Black, and they should be looking after what's good for Black students. They want to have political power. Vote for Black officials. Get Black officials into your local government, into your state government, to represent your district in Congress. They really preach self-reliance. We don't need to rely on the white man. Self-respect. Have racial pride. Be proud that you're African American. Be proud of who you are. Don't just try to be like the white man. And so these are some of the things that the Black Power movement was pushing for during Malcolm X's time as probably the central figure, and then even after his assassination. After the assassination of Malcolm X, probably the most influential Black Power group became the Black Panthers, and they rejected this whole concept of nonviolence. They said that if you could take care of your community and take care of your families without using violence, that's great, but if you need to resort to violence, then by whatever means necessary, as Malcolm X had said. And so they rejected this whole idea of nonviolence. Three of the big leaders of the Black Panthers were Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver. The Black Panthers were actually organized in Oakland, California in the 1960s, and they became very prevalent throughout California and other parts of the country. Their voice and their organization really helped to expand the civil rights movement and the civil rights area ideas to the urban areas. That it keeps bringing awareness that this is not just a Southern problem, it's a systemic problem throughout American society, even in the North, and a lot of Northerners did not want to hear that. They pushed for equality in jobs and housing. They want better jobs and housing in those urban areas. They pushed for housing legislation to make sure that the tenement buildings in those ghettos are better, safer, cleaner places for people to live. But they also pushed for cultural awareness, bringing African Americans to the kind of a revival, really, of the Harlem Renaissance, that you should be proud of African music, African hairstyles. The Afro became very popular during this time. Don't try to make your hair look like white people. You know, and so the holding the fist in the air became the symbol of the Black Power movement. As the violence and discontent in these urban areas continued, the federal government decided to create a commission to look into why did we have the riots in Watts and the other urban areas, what was causing this, and how can we prevent this in the future. And this became known as the Kerner Commission. And when the Kerner Commission did their investigation and their report, they came out and they said that Black frustration with lack of jobs and economic opportunities, lack of cultural awareness in the schools had caused this frustration that erupted into violence. And so if we want to prevent violence of this type in the future, we must create better job opportunities, we must end segregation, and we must begin to truly become a united society. So the Kerner Commission really validated a lot of what Dr. Martin Luther King had been saying for years, that we need job opportunities, we need to end segregation. Also in 1968, after this Kerner Commission report came out. We will get another Civil Rights Act. This is the Civil Rights Act of 1968. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 called for equal housing opportunities regardless of race. And so it said that you could no longer deny people the right to buy a house in a certain neighborhood or rent an apartment in a certain neighborhood based on race. This is something that you would have thought would have come out earlier, but finally in 1968 it's actually validated into federal law. The 1968 Civil Rights Act also gave federal protection to civil rights workers. It said that if civil rights workers were attacked when they went into these communities, that it was a violation of federal law and they would be tried in federal court. This was very important because what we had seen in many of the southern states, like when Medgar Evers was assassinated in Mississippi, his assassin got off, had a mistrial like 2 or 3 times, and it was not until the 1980s before he was finally found guilty of murdering Medgar Evers. When the 3 civil rights workers were killed in Mississippi during Freedom Summer, their assassins were also found not guilty, and they got off from that. So now that takes it out of the realm of the state and local courts, and it says that when civil rights workers are attacked or killed, that they will be tried in federal court. The villains will be tried in federal court, not state court. Another very tragic event occurred in the spring of 1968, and that is the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King had traveled to Tennessee to give a speech to garbage workers who were on strike in that city, to give them some inspiration and ideas about fighting for equal job opportunities, when he was assassinated by James Earl Ray in that city. After the assassination of Dr. King, we see another huge eruption of violence across many of the cities in the country in retaliation against the assassination of this beloved leader of them. It is one of the great tragedies of American society also. A couple of months later, in June of 1968, Robert Kennedy, who was running for the presidency, was assassinated also. And so we see that there is some very difficult times ahead for America after these assassinations. When we look at the 1960s, they seem to be really kind of characterized by the assassinations of 3 of our great leaders of the time: Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy. And the assassinations of these individuals who were trying to bring about a better society for all Americans and equality in society for all Americans really brought a death of idealism among a lot of Americans. We also look at the 1960s really as an age of violence and discontent. Not only do we have this civil rights movement going on, but of course this is also the time that Vietnam is occurring, and our next and final PowerPoint will be on the Vietnam conflict. And we will see that Vietnam will also spark a lot of marches and demonstrations against the war. And because of the disillusionment really of a lot of young Americans, we began to see kind of the dropout movement. People dropped out of school, they dropped out of society. We see these hippies, joining communes and traveling around the country, being very discontent with society and that the ability to make changes in society. And they kind of defined that age, that America was kind of going to hell in a handbasket, and they had joined the movement, and then the great leaders of the movement had been assassinated, and so they lost hope. And there's this sense kind of really of loss of hope that we see with the 1960s. So this ends our PowerPoint on the Civil Rights Movement, which is going to be really the central focus of what you're going to see in Chapter 27. And then our next and final PowerPoint will be on Vietnam, which we will take all of the areas of Vietnam, which are scattered over many chapters in your book, and put them into one PowerPoint at the end.